good afternoon from Jerusalem, and welcome to this special event organized by the European Department of the School for Holocaust Studies at Yad Vashem. My name is Rocco Giansante, and I'm responsible for the Italian desk. Last week, we commemorated the 75th anniversary since the liberation of Europe from Nazi fascism, which brought also to its end the concentration camp system. So today we will reflect on that watershed moment in history and also on its implications to our present situation. And we will do so with the lecture Seeing the Camps, Exploring the Visual Memory of the Holocaust by Dr. Tobias Ebbrecht-Hartmann. Tobias is a lecturer in the Department of Communication and Journalism and in the European Forum at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His major field of research is the visual memory of the Holocaust, investigating films, photographs, and digital archives. He is currently part of the EU-funded research project Visual History of the Holocaust, Rethinking Curation in the Digital Age, which is conducted by 13 Austrian, German, Israeli, and French research institutions, museums, memorial sites, and technology developers. With his team of researchers at the Hebrew University, Tobias explores the afterlife of the Allied liberation and atrocity films in post-war popular culture. He has published widely in international scientific journals, and he's the author of German language studies, which translated in English is Historical Images in Media Memory, Film Narrations of the Holocaust, and it came out in 2011. So before we start the lecture, I just I would like to ask you to please, if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat function of Zoom. And then at the end of the lecture, Tobias will address all your insights and questions. So without further ado, I leave the screen to Tobias. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rocco, for this kind introduction. It's a great honor for me to be invited to give this online lecture on this specific occasion, the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Europe from National Socialism. And I'm also very honored to do that in context of Yad Vashem's work on preserving the memory of the Holocaust, of the Shoah. And so thank you very much to Yad Vashem, to the International School for Holocaust Studies, and especially to the European Department that invited me. And I think here some of the listeners are working for the school, and some graduates from former programs are here too. So I think this is also a very good opportunity to say thank you to the staff of Yad Vashem for being such great researchers, lecturers, hosts, guides. Yeah, and I have to say that a lot of the insight which I present is also a result of my long-term cooperation with Yad Vashem. Parts of what I present to you today is also, as was already said in the introduction, preliminary results of the Research and Innovation Action Visual History of the Holocaust, Rethinking Curation in the Digital Age. The aim of this international collaborative project is to create new access to the historical film footage from atrocities and from the liberated camps, which were recorded by Allied cameramen on various fronts in the war. We intend to digitize this footage and to make it accessible and available through an online repository, which encourages also active engagement with the footage, and especially also the contextualization of the footage and to create new relations to testimonies, to other historical sources, and as it was already said, also to the visual memory of the Holocaust in general. I also want to thank the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, which currently hosts me as a fellow, because this is also part of my research there on a project related to digital Holocaust memory. So this lecture is not a lecture about the history of the liberation of the camps. The main focus, which I want to offer today, is to look at this particular moment in time, this specific time period in the beginning of 1945, as a moment of mutual encounters of different perspectives, especially the first contact between the liberators and those who were liberated in the camps. When we are talking about the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Europe from National Socialism, of course, what comes to our mind and what will be the focus of this lecture is the period before May 8th, where the Allied armies started to see and to encounter atrocities which could not have been imagined before that. But we also should keep in mind that this period does not start in 1945, but it already started in summer of 1944 when the Soviets discovered the concentration and annihilation camp Majdanek. So what did the people see? What was visible? What could they see when they entered the camps? And what did the world see in consequence of the films and photos which were done there? We have a very special anniversary this year. It's not only the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the camps, it's also an anniversary which is in the shadow of COVID-19. So many memorials were forced to cancel their celebrations or to start to conduct them in a very limited scale. And of course, this also meant to shift the commemoration to online media in order to gain more importance to this events. So the main question which I will address in this lecture is, what can we do about the historical images, about the photos which were recorded in the camps, and what can they actually tell us? So what I want to propose is that we need to look at these images and try to understand what they tell us from the level of their content, from the level of their context, but also in relation to the impact they had on the later shaping of Holocaust memory, and especially the visual memory of the Holocaust. One important aspect here is to recontextualize these images by adding additional voices, especially the voices of the survivors. And in order to start encountering this particular moment of the mutual encounter of liberators and those liberated, I want to play a short sequence of a testimony of Jack Terry, who was liberated here in the Flossenbürg concentration camp 75 years ago, Flossenbürg in Bavaria, which, as you see today, is also closed for visitors and had to shift all their anniversary activities online. So this is how Jack Terry remembers this moment.
Jack Terry, a survivor of the Flossenbürg concentration camp.
All the people who were left in the camp who could still walk were standing in front of this stage. We were a bunch of depressed, sad people because some of them were still in the hospital sick, some were still dying. We weren't jumping up and down, we weren't celebrating, we weren't singing. If I remember correctly, it was part of our routine. We had been so used to not being happy. So this was not a happy occasion as such.
So maybe this is irritating to hear Jack Terry talking about liberation and emphasizing that this was not a happy occasion. So this moment was a moment which was not related always and primarily to joy, but to questions of life and death. And it was also for the soldiers who liberated the camps, something which they did not expect it and which they did not had on in mind. And so an important question is, what actually did the soldiers see? How did they encounter these camps? And this short clip I want to show you is from Sergeant Raymond Buch, an American soldier who was liberating or part of those liberating Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. And we see here a private film, not an official film recording, which was made for particular purposes, but a private film in which we can get an idea of how the soldiers encountered these places.
Sergeant Raymond Buch had a personal camera with him when he entered the Mauthausen concentration camp days after it was liberated by the United States Army. Here we see on the main gate of the camp a banner erected by Spanish anti-fascist prisoners welcoming American troops.
The most important feature here in this private movie is the panning of the camera. The camera really follows the gaze, the private gaze of the soldier, of the American soldier here. And we see a kind of mode of searching, a mode of registering what is happening there, what happened there, but also a mode of reframing, of trying to make sense, of trying to understand the logics of this place. So what we have here is also the transformation of a soldier with a camera to a witness that tries to focus, that tries to put into the frame what was happening in the concentration camps. Mike Lewis was an army cameraman for the British Army, and he was filming in one of the liberated concentration camps in Germany, in Bergen-Belsen, which showed devastating conditions to those to the liberators. And this is also what Mike Lewis describes in his testimony.
We drove in and saw a sight that shook us as nothing, even the sights of war, had ever shown us before. It was pain to look at it, pain that this could happen to people. There were hundreds and hundreds of dead bodies piled up. There was a stench of death everywhere. There was pits containing bodies of people as large as lawn tennis courts, containing babies, girls, youths, men, women, old, young, and how deep we didn't know.
Lewis' description already shows that it's somehow beyond imagination what the cameraman, what the soldiers saw there. And this, of course, made it also very difficult to somehow record, to preserve the conditions in these camps. And what he also describes is that the images, the photos and the films which we have today as documents of this situation are not related to the primary sense which was addressed from the situation at these places, when he emphasizes the stench, which is really something what many soldiers emphasized as their first encounter experience, then we see that this was a multi-sensual experience, and also an experience which was beyond the patterns of understanding which the soldiers had learned during the years in war and in combat before. So what and how did the survivors feel in this moment? And like in the quote of Jack Terry, also this survivor here makes clear that that this was not a moment of kind of mutual joy, but that this had really a lot to do with moments of looking at who is looking and how is somebody looking, how are we encountering each other. So here a survivor said, the soldiers came up to the fence and just stood there looking at us. I couldn't understand their behavior at all. I wish I could tell you how eerie that was, watching them staring at us in that inexplicable way. But then I saw one of the soldiers double over and throw up. Soon another was doing the same, and then another, and then I understood. They were looking at us in disgust. A moment after that first soldier threw up, a strange thing happened among the prisoners. We began turning away from them. We turned our backs to them. We didn't want them to see us. So besides this very irritating situation which is described here in this testimony, we really see that the moment of seeing the camps, seeing the prisoners, but also seeing the liberators is a very, very complex moment, which in this particular moment in time condensed so different and so complex memories, knowledge, experiences, that it's very difficult to put this complexity into a particular picture, which is always about a question of perspective. Here, for example, in this shot from Bergen-Belsen, we see a British cameraman filming German camp guards who had to move away the dead bodies and clean up the camp. And this is how Mike Lewis describes the difficulties of filming, and also maybe even more important, the difficulties of dealing with these visual memories.
We were there for about 2 weeks filming all these sites, which no film which I've seen since really conveys the feeling of despair and horror that can be done to people who are Europeans of another faith for no other reason. And I thought as time went by, it might leave me. I wanted to forget. But it never does leave you.
Many, on all sides of the Allied armies, officers and experts dealing with the, especially with film and with information, decided that it will be necessary to make recordings in these liberated camps. And Sidney Bernstein was at that time working at the British Psychological Warfare Department. He already had some experience with preparing anti-Nazi films, which were used during the war. And when he visited Bergen-Belsen, it was immediately clear that it is necessary not only to document what is seen here, but also to edit a film out of this, which would be a film that create another encounter now between audiences in the world with the situation and the conditions in these camps. So this was really a unique moment in history, that from the beginning these atrocities were somehow asked for a response by film cameras that recorded these conditions as evidence, and that intended to present this evidence not only in court, but also to the larger public. Bernstein said, "The effect of these films on audiences everywhere has been very powerful and has brought home the horror of these camps much more efficiently than it was possible with still photographs, news stories, or radio broadcasts." So cinema was seen here as the medium which could really somehow communicate some of this experience. And this is very interesting when we, for example, remember that Susan Sontag in her seminal book about photography also writes that for her as a young woman, it was such a significant moment when for the first time she encountered the photographs of the liberated camps, and that this shock encounter was really something which never left her during her life. And and this relates also to a potential which not only photography, but especially cinema has, which the German cinema critic who was forced to emigrate from Germany, first to France and then to the United States, Siegfried Krakauer, once described by comparing the cinema screen with Medusa's shield, and saying that it is impossible, if it is impossible to directly look at atrocities and things which are too overwhelming and too shocking, then the cinema screen works like the shield of Medusa, in which you can somehow, like in a mirror, you can encounter and confront these atrocities. And when Krakauer was writing this in his theory of film, he was thinking explicitly of the atrocity footage which was recorded in the camps. I want to now show you 3 clips from one of the movies that were planned in 1945 by Allies in order to document the situations in the concentration camps and to make this accessible for a broader public. What is interesting about this film is that this film was not finished in 1945 and never made its way to the audiences, neither in Germany, nor in Britain, nor in the world. And this is the film German Concentration Camps: A Factual Survey, which Sidney Bernstein originally intended to produce, and which he wanted to produce as a film that should show the shocking images, but that show it in the way that it would create a kind of learning effect and not only an overwhelming shocking effect. So this is why in this film it's very interesting really to look in a very detailed way on the production of the shots, on the selection of the shots, and on the editing, because we can learn a lot about how in the time the filmmakers saw or thought about how to represent the camps. German concentration camps survived, the film survived in a rough cut in an archive in London, and was nevertheless seen in parts and fragments in other films, documentary films that were made after the war. So most of the footage circulated in other films before in 1985. A first reconstruction of this film was released under the title Memory of the Camps, but only in 2016, a restored and reconstructed version of this film was released to the public.
Will still go on. There seems to be no end. The SS men are not so spick and span now. 7 days of being shouted and cursed at and handling corpses by the hundred are beginning to tell. The burgomeisters and civil officials of the neighborhood were brought to witness the scenes that had been caused as part of the Nazi scheme of things. This was not what they expected.
This scene is not only special because it is one of the few scenes with synchronized sound in the film. So we hear here some of the prisoners shouting at the SS men and guards that are forced here to bury the dead. It is also not only and primarily of interest because it shows in a very direct way, in a very graphic way, the horrible conditions which the British found when they liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. I think this particular scene is especially interesting because it really combines all the different perspectives which are here, which are part of this specific moment. We see the prisoners shouting, female prisoners shouting here. We see the German SS guards who transformed from guards to prisoners themselves and are here forced to act, to perform an act of decency, which of course is also an act of humiliation. And we see the British soldiers here. And there is also another perspective, which is the perspective of the more or less ordinary Germans, of the neighbors, of the onlookers. And this is a particularly important aspect of the liberation films, that the Allies from the beginning intended to create footage which is not only evidence, but which also includes witnesses of people or people watching in order to somehow gain evidence to the evidence. That's the reason why I want to really offer a close look and a close reading of this short sequence.
Will still go on.
So these are some of the shots of the sequence, and we see that the whole thing starts with a medium shot. And in this medium shot, we see the witnesses, the burgomeisters of the neighboring towns, the people who say they did not know about it. We see them in a medium shot because we should really engage with them. We should create contact with them as persons. Yeah, they are here, so to say, doubling our own perspective of secondary witnesses of the situation in the camp. And the most important thing is to connect this medium shot of the witnesses within the film to the atrocity, which is the crime scene. And interestingly here, this is a panorama shot, which of course wants to produce a coherent representation of the crime and the topography of the crime. So this is only possible in the panorama shot. So how is now this medium shot of the burgomeisters connected to the crime scene? And this is very interesting because we have here a panning shot which is not disrupted. And according to the reports about the making of this film, this was an idea or a suggestion of Alfred Hitchcock, who was asked by Sidney Bernstein to advise in making this film. And Hitchcock said, you have to do everything to prevent that people could deny what was happening and what you were seeing there in the camps. So try not to do too much editing, try not to do suggestive editing, but use long panning shots so that the people can really see here's no cutting in between. And this is actually what is happening here. So we start at this truck where dead bodies are unloaded and carried to the pit. So this is one shot. And we see also there is a kind of marker because within this panning shots, we again encounter the burgomeisters, the witnesses of the scene. So you see here that specific cinematic techniques were used on purpose in order to create this evidence. The second scene I want to show you is not recorded by a British cameraman, but shows the conditions in the Majdanek concentration and annihilation camp, which was discovered by Soviet armies and which where not only Soviet but also Polish cameramen who were part of the Red Army at that time filmed this situation, and this was the first encounter, so to say, with such a concentration camp. Not the first encounter, of course, with atrocities.
Not only at Auschwitz was extermination carried out on a large scale. Entire populations of villages were moved suddenly overnight, believing themselves to being evacuated and finding themselves behind barbed wire in the morning. $2,800,000 people were gassed to death here. Invariably, the gas chamber was labeled bath and disinfection. Here, one took one's last breath and disappeared in oily smoke up the crematorium chimney. The firm that built this was not ashamed to sign its work. Again the ovens, again the bones. These bones were sold to the Strem company for the manufacture of fertilizer. How many hundreds of thousands of people are contained in these heaps of human bones? You see where they went, to the cabbage fields. No doubt some Germans today can taste what they have eaten, fertilized by their comrades. This had been going on for a long time before we came. Here were found 820,000 pairs of boots and shoes. Prisoners paid their own fares to Majdanek. They thought they were going to new homes, and so they brought their most precious portable possessions.
This footage, one of the first films which showed this footage was the film Majdanek Cemetery of Europe, which was directed and edited by Alexander Ford, himself a very interesting person, already a filmmaker before the war. He joined the Red Army, fought against the Germans after the occupation of his home country, Poland, and was one of those who started to circulate, to edit, and to contextualize this footage, which was recorded at Majdanek, and later on Ford also continued making films, some of the most important Polish films, also dealing with the history of the Second World War. Also in films in Israel. Unfortunately, then he was expelled from Poland in the end of the 1960s due to anti-Semitic actions. But nevertheless, one of the most important Polish directors who here for and with the Soviets made one of the most important films about the Nazi concentration camps. And what is interesting about this particular sequence, which I showed you, is not only that we see here so many shots which later became iconic, really iconic, like the barbed wire, the chimney, the watchtowers, the Cyclone B boxes, the gas chambers. All of these shots you could see in many documentary films produced later after the war. But most significant here is, of course, this scene at the end of this particular sequence, where the Soviet cameraman recorded all the leftovers, the belongings of those who were murdered in Majdanek. Piles of shoes, piles of other belongings. And what we already see here in the sequence, so already in the time, so to say, is that these leftovers, these objects, these remnants, somehow replace or function as stand-ins for those who were murdered. They are so to say the last traces of the people who were murdered, and thereby they start to represent them. And what is also happening is that we have here an interesting effect, which we can maybe describe as a metonymic image. So the piles of shoes, the piles of glasses and other belongings start to replace the way too shocking and the way too horrific images from the piles of dead bodies. We see shoes, but we imagine people. And this is a very important aspect when we are talking about the representation of the camps. And it's interesting that it's already started in 1945, or in the time that somehow these shots became metonymic for the Holocaust in its whole. A picture which shows something which is absent, and thereby becomes a representation of what we cannot really stand to watch. I want to demonstrate how this footage really informed and shaped our visual memory of the Holocaust by comparing two scenes from two different movies that both became kind of canonic for the visual memory of the Holocaust. The first, Night and Fog, by Alain Resnais, was made 10 years after the end of the war. Nevertheless, it was a film which for a whole generation created a first-time encounter with the horrors of the camps. Although this is not a film about the Holocaust, Jews are mentioned only once in this film. It is definitely a film about the concentration camps. It is a film that somehow makes the concentration camp system accessible in a present which is on the one hand marked by silence and on the other hand marked by new conflicts, which especially of course affect France, but also other countries. Night and Fog is so interesting because Alain Resnais combines footage which he himself recorded in Auschwitz and Majdanek with footage which he discovered in the archives. So black and white and color create a kind of resonating space for these particular memories. The second film, Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, actually is also not a film about the Holocaust, about the Shoah. It's a film about an exception. It's a film about a rescue of Jews by the industrial, by a German industrial, Oskar Schindler. And the scene which I want to show you is really a key scene in the film. Why? Because it really kind of shows the essence of the film Schindler's List in a nutshell. It is, so to say, a kind of miniature of the whole film, because this scene shows also the exception. It also shows a rescue, but the rescue, of course, was not the rule in the Holocaust, it was the exception. And so the scene, in a very interesting way, combines the singular act of rescuing. In this case, Schindler rescues his accountant, Yitzhak Stern, his Jewish accountant, Yitzhak Stern, who accidentally was boarded on a deportation train. And the scene combines this with what is actually absent from the film, which is the more general experience of deportation to death and mass murder. And I think you see when I show you both here in a split screen mode, how there is a certain resonance which refers to the constant recreation, reenacting, but also kind of elusive references to the images which we have from the liberated concentration camps.
Stern! 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 Yitzhak Stern! My apologies. He's here! Stop the train! Stop the train!
Here, neutral there. It makes no difference to us, you understand? This one, that one. It's the inconvenience to the list. It's the paperwork.
I somehow left my work card at home. I tried to explain them. It was a mistake, but I'm sorry, I'm stupid.
What if I got here 5 minutes later? Then where would I be?
So, and this now is the crossing point. So now the camera does not follow Schindler and Stern, but follows these suitcases, which of course represent the dead.
Voici les réserves des nazis en guerre. Leur grenier. Que des cheveux de femme. À 15 pfennig le kilo, on en fait du tissu. Avec les os.
So I think it became clear here, not only that Steven Spielberg directly referred to this well-known footage from the concentration camps, and maybe even to the editing of this footage in Night and Fog, but also how he uses this effect in Schindler's List to show us objects and images that demonstrate the absence of someone, and thereby start to become the replacement of what is not shown, which is death and annihilation. The last scene which I want to show to you is was also taken by Soviet cameramen, this time in Auschwitz, at the liberation following January 27, 1945. So some days after the liberation, Soviet cameramen came to the camp and started to document and also partly to reenact scenes for the evidence which they intended to create.
As these children were written off, unknown, they had no names, only numbers tattooed on their arms.
So this scene also became iconic, and it also refers to one of the most central elements in the commemoration or memory, and especially visual, but also physical memory, so to say, of the Holocaust, which is the significance of the number which was tattooed on the arms of prisoners in Auschwitz, which refers, of course, to the loss of identity, which refers to the fact that a name is replaced through a number, which also refers to the physical mark, which is tattooed on the body, on the actual prisoner's body. And seeing here children showing their arms with the numbers to the camera became a very significant visual gesture and visual composition. And again, it's very important to look closely on the composition of this scene, that we start with a medium shot, which gives us the possibility to connect with the children, to really see them as individuals, but also to see them as part of a group of many who had the same fate. followed by a close-up shot. The close-up shot, which is of course intended to present details to us, and thereby the number, the tattooed number on the arm, so to explicitly asks, so to say, for the close-up shot in order to make this mark visible, combined with the gesture of revealing the arm and showing it to the camera, which is of course also a responsive act of the children or of the people who are filmed here, demonstrating, showing something to the camera, reacting towards the camera. A gesture, by the way, which of course became later iconic and which we know also from survivors who presented their numbers as leftover mark of their experiences. And then another medium shot, which now again emphasizes that these children are not single individuals, but have a common fate. These shots were made by Soviet cameramen in Auschwitz, as I already said, where the Red Army discovered 10,000 to 20,000 dead bodies. 180 children, most of them who were part of the experiments which were conducted there in the camp, remained and survived. These shots here were taken in February. We see here also, we do not only see here an iconic photograph or an iconic image, we also see people here, we see survivors here, and so it's, I think, worthwhile to use this footage also as another trace, where we try to somehow give back names, so to say, for those that were stripped of their names and that were reduced to numbers. So we see here several people, survivors, Michael Bornstein, Sarah Rikimura, Rene Gutmann-Slotkin and Tova Friedman. Sarah was born in Radom in 1940. She was deported to Auschwitz in August 1944 and then liberated when she was 4. Michael, his mother, grandmother, father, and older brother were taken from Poland, from Zarki, to Auschwitz, and he was 4 years old when he was liberated and survived with his grandmother, only with his grandmother. And René lived in Prague with his parents and his twin sister, to where they had fled from Dresden. And shortly before his 6th birthday, they were deported to Auschwitz from the Theresienstadt ghetto. Tova Friedman also gave a video testimony where she remembers this moment of liberation and also the encounter with the Soviet cameraman. So this is, of course, also an approach to somehow give voice to those kind of silent images, or to those images which are usually defined by voiceover. So this is how Tova remembers these moments.
And came out of the hospital. I remember I didn't have my shoes on because I hadn't, and we were sort of things were burning, and she was holding my hand, and there were no SS around, no Nazi around or anything. Now here my memory is very vague, because I thought that we were walking straight to the barbed wires that were still electrified. And I thought that the Russians came within a very short time. From history, I learned that it was a week later that the Russians came. But I can't remember how I lived the week when I walked out of the hospital until the Russians came. Somehow, to me, in my head, it was like the time got shorter, as if the Russians came. But the next thing I remember, the next thing that's very strong in my mind, was standing at the barbed wires, and somebody says, "The Russians are coming." And within no time, there were these trucks or whatever were there, and they cut the electricity. I remember that, and the kissing, and the kissing, and this, and I remember all that, and the jumping, and the food. And then a Russian said, he wants to see my number. And he took a movie of many of us with our numbers.
So here we see, of course, how the subjectivity of this memory and also of this moment, something which, of course, the camera cannot really capture, but the camera nevertheless can create a trace which needs more contextualization, which needs to be related to other sources, which needs to be combined with other voices, and which, of course, needs to be seen. So the primary intention, of course, of the liberation footage was to use it as evidence. Most of it was shown during the Nuremberg trials. There was an American film, Nazi concentration camps, and a Soviet film, which was shown during the trials. There were other trials using this kind of footage. And the trial is, of course, a very interesting place for showing a movie, because it is about understanding something which is absent, something which had happened before and which needs to be reconstructed. And this exactly is what Stanley Kramer, in his film Judgment at Nuremberg, tried to show when he presented this scene of the children revealing their arms in Auschwitz as part of an evidence movie shown in the trial which he presented in his film. And it's very interesting to see here now the combination of the historical footage and the reactions and responses of those looking at this footage. So we first see here a shot of the German defendant, a judge who does not want to acknowledge the court, and who also resists in watching this footage. And the next person you see is the American judge, and it's interesting how they react to this footage.
Shrunken to 1/5 their normal size.
So you see that
a human pelvis,
that the German starts for the
ashtray.
first time looking towards the screen exactly
Children
when this
who've
scene
been tattooed to mark them for eventual extermination. Sometimes mercy was shown to the children. They were injected with morphia so they'd be unconscious when hanged.
And on the other hand, the
One of the
American
doctors
judge
described how they'd then place ropes around their necks.
now is not capable
And in the
anymore
doctor's
to
own
watch
words,
and lowers
like
his sight.
pictures, they were then hanged by hooks on the walls.
And this, of course, is a very clear relation to other atrocities, to the atrocities, to racist atrocities against Afro-Americans, which, of course, was the time when this film was made, and also the political struggle not only the director, but also many of the actors were involved in. So what we see here also is a perfect example of the complex afterlife of the memory of the camps in popular culture. The shot of the tattooed number were used in many documentaries, for example, in The Last Days, where it is then used in a transition shot to move over to the same gesture which is made by a survivor. And the film Number, these radio documentary Numbered, for example, consists only of these kind of survivors that still bear this number. So the implicit reference or indirect reference to this footage of Auschwitz is also one which relates to the person of the survivor, and also to the aging of the survivor. But it is also used, of course, as a very iconic image in feature films like Labyrinth of Lies. It is reenacted in several seminal graphic novels, Maus by Spiegelman, The Second Generation by Kiszka, and of course, very, very important also in the writings of Primo Levi. His number plays a crucial role. But what we also see is a kind of more indirect relation between the historical footage through this gesture and through the tattooed number. In a film like X-Men Last Stand, which uses the Holocaust as a kind of backstory of one of its protagonists, in the last season of The Man in the High Castle, where it's a kind of alternative history, where then also black people were sent to camps. in a film which is not related to the Holocaust at all, we feel this kind of very implicit resonance when this girl 11, which escaped from human experiments, reveals the number tattooed on her arm, and even the Netflix series Unorthodox, Unorthodox, when we see this young Jewish women from this very ultra-Orthodox community, when she's in Berlin entering a club and showing the stamp on her arm, of course this creates a lot of kind of implicit resonances to this particular footage. So we are now at a point where we see that the historical footage from the concentration camps became, so to say, a way of imagining the situation in the camps. And Michel Kiszka, whose father survived the camps but did not talk a lot about it, really shows this in this collage, which shows a dream where all these icons somehow move together and create one kind of a fantasy, which is very closely related also to the idea of post-memory, which was introduced by Marianne Hirsch as a media-based secondary memory of these events. Closing now, I want to ask what now? What is happening now? How can we engage with this liberation, re-engage with this liberation footage that already became iconic and somehow disconnected from the historical context? And I want to end with this split screen montage of the private footage of Raymond Buch, which we saw in the beginning, and an online project which the Mauthausen Memorial launched this year for the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the camp, because when they asked people to draw pictures based on the famous iconic image of the Mauthausen camp gate, and upload them with a hashtag, and then created this kind of montage film out of it.
Here we see on the main gate of the camp a banner erected by Spanish anti-fascist prisoners welcoming American troops. Here we see on the main gate of the camp a banner erected by Spanish anti-fascist prisoners welcoming American troops.
So this is a way of using these icons not as kind of replacement of the historic experience, not just to trigger certain kind of visual memories, but to ask for new forms of engagement. And today, in this particular situation of isolated quarantine, of a period of commemorating the liberation, but not being able to meet with others and share these memories, especially with the survivors, I think this project, as well as several other online projects, were a very interesting way to create an active and engaging way of producing memories, of producing something in response to the particular history of the liberated camps. And of course also a significant part of it, the visual memory of these camps, which was preserved in the atrocity and liberation films. So thank you very much for your attention.